And we're going to hear from Tal Norman and Orna Peleg from Tel Aviv University. And they will talk about visual simulation during L1 and L2 sentence comprehension, a divided visual field study.
Okay, so can you hear me and see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm going to present 2 experiments from my PhD work that was conducted under the supervision of Professor Orna Peleg at Tel Aviv University. So in this work, I examined whether bilinguals process and understand words and sentences in their 2 languages in the same way. And I tried to answer this question by comparing the extent to which each language is embodied. So what is embodiment? Theories of embodied cognition assume that language comprehension involves sensory motor simulations of the described situation. This means that the same sensory motor and affective representations, which are activated in response to real objects and events, are also activated in response to verbally described objects and events. This assumption is supported by an extensive body of evidence. Neuroimaging studies have demonstrated that the same cortical areas that are responsible for the processing of specific sensory motor information are also activated during language comprehension. For example, action-related words like lick, pick, and kick activate effector-specific motor regions that are also involved in the execution of these same actions. Behavioral studies have also shown that modality-specific knowledge is activated during language comprehension. For example, priming studies have shown that responses to target words denoting objects are faster after a prime word that share with the target manipulation features, like piano and typewriter. In addition, many studies have demonstrated perceptual or motor compatibility effects. For example, after reading the sentence, "the man got the present out of his trunk," responses to target pictures are faster for a picture of a big present than for a picture of a small present. This evidence indicates that language comprehension involves not only the activation of verbal representations, but also the activation of sensory motor knowledge. In addition, it is assumed that the co-occurrence of language processing and sensory motor processing connects them over time. So when we hear the word apple and eat an apple at the same time, the links between linguistic and sensory motor representations are created and become stronger. Therefore, the existence and strength of these links, which enable the construction of embodied simulations, may depend on the extent to which language users activate them simultaneously. Under this assumption, the links between L2 representations and sensory motor representations may be weaker or may not exist, especially among bilinguals who have learned their L2 later in life in a formal setting and have not had the opportunity to use their L2 in a natural and immersive environment. So it is currently unclear whether embodied theories can be extended to second language processing. So therefore, in experiment 1, we tested the embodiment of the L2 by comparing L1 and L2 processing within the same bilinguals, by testing bilinguals who have learned and used their L2 mainly in formal and unimmersive settings, and by focusing on perceptual visual simulations. Specifically, we examined whether sentence comprehension in a formally learned L2 involves visual simulations to the same extent as in a naturally acquired L1. We predicted that this type of bilinguals will produce weaker visual simulations in the L2 relative to the L1, because of weaker links between verbal and visual knowledge. Okay, so this experiment included 80 participants. All were students from Tel Aviv University. They were all late Hebrew English bilinguals that started to learn English after the age 6 in school and have lived only in Israel since birth. We tested a relatively homogeneous group of L2 users, both in terms of their language experience, as well as in terms of their proficiency. So to measure visual activations during L1 and L2 sentence reading, we used the sentence picture verification task. In this task, participants read sentences. After each sentence, they saw a picture of an object and had to decide whether or not the object in the picture was mentioned in the sentence. On all critical tries, the pictured object was indeed mentioned in the sentence, so the correct response in these tries was always yes. Critically, the pictured object was presented in one of two shape conditions. In the match condition, the visual shape of the pictured object matched the shape implied by the sentence. However, in the mismatch condition, these two shapes were different. So now I'm going to show you an example of a critical try in the match condition. And this is the mismatch condition. So if language comprehenders generate visual shape simulations during sentence reading, they are expected to produce a significant shape effect in which responses are faster on match than on mismatch trials. This is expected because the visual representations that are activated during sentence reading facilitate the subsequent visual processing of a picture with similar visual features. To compare L1 and L2 processing, all participants performed the task in their L1 and L2. L1 and L2 sentences were presented in two successive blocks, and the order of the blocks was counterbalanced across participants. So have performed the L1 block first and have performed the L2 block first. And to control for the possible influence of block on task performance, the block variable first or second was also included in the analysis. So the fixed factors that were included in the analysis were shape condition, target language, and block. Okay, so I will discuss the results by presenting the shape effect in milliseconds, which is the difference in min RTs between mismatch and match trials. So here you can see the shape effect by target language, L1 or L2, in each block, first or second. The analysis revealed a significant three-way interaction between shape condition, target language, and block. So this means that the block variable significantly modulated the shape effect in both languages, but in opposite directions and to different extents. In the L1, the effect was smaller in the second block than in the first block. Yet in the L2, the effect in the second block was more pronounced than in the first block. So because the shape effect in both languages differed between the first and the second block, here I will focus only on first block trials in which task performance could not have been affected by the other block. So in the first block, the two-way interaction between shape condition and target language was significant. The shape effect was significant in the L1 and was hardly evident in the L2. This indicates that visual shape features were substantially activated only during L1 sentence reading. Our next step was to test the separability of each hemisphere to activate visual shape features during sentence reading in both languages. So generally, it is agreed that the two hemispheres differ in their processing abilities. While most verbal processes are typically lateralized to the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere has an advantage over the left hemisphere in non-verbal visual processing. In addition, it is now commonly accepted that both hemispheres are involved in language comprehension, but in distinct and complementary ways. However, the exact contribution of the right hemisphere to language comprehension is still under investigation. So we suspected that the right hemisphere may contribute to language comprehension by visually simulating the verbal content due to its advantage in visual processing. One way to test the independent processing of each hemisphere is the divided visual field technique. In this technique, target stimuli are presented briefly, either in the left or in the right visual field, and therefore are initially perceived and processed either by the right or by the left hemisphere, respectively. In this way, responses to laterally presented stimuli mainly reflect the processing of the corresponding hemisphere. So in experiment 2, we used the divided visual field technique to examine whether visual simulations during L1 and L2 sentence comprehension are generated to the same extent by both hemispheres. We predicted that visual simulations will be stronger in the right than in the left hemisphere. In addition, we predicted that in the right hemisphere, visual simulations will be weaker in the L2 relative to the L1. The stimuli in experiment 2 was identical to that we used in experiment 1. However, while sentences were presented centrally as in experiment 1, target pictures were presented laterally, either in the right visual field to the left hemisphere or in the left visual field to the right hemisphere. Note that the processing of the target pictures in each visual field mainly reflects the processing of the centrally presented sentence by the corresponding hemisphere. So if visual simulations during sentence reading are generated by a specific hemisphere, then a significant shape effect should be exhibited when target pictures are presented to this hemisphere. So in this experiment, we tested 160 participants that had the same characteristics as participants in experiment 1. The fixed factors that were included in the analysis were shape condition, target language, visual field, and block. As in experiment 1, I will discuss the results by presenting the shape effect in milliseconds, which is the difference in mean RTs between the mismatch and the match trials. So here you can see the shape effect by visual field, right or left, and target language, L1 or L2, in each block, first or second. In the first block, the shape effect was more pronounced in the left than in the right visual field in both languages. However, in the second block, the difference in the shape effect between the left and the right visual fields completely disappeared in the L1. So it appears that the block factor modulated to some extent the shape effect in the L1, yet analyzing the entire data set of first and second block trials did not reveal significant four-way interaction between shape condition, target language, visual field, and block. And that is assumingly because of insufficient power. However, to neutralize the possible influence of block and to reveal a clearer picture of their interaction between shape condition and visual field in each language, we decided to focus only on first block trials. This decision was also supported by the results of experiment 1, which demonstrated a significant modulation of the shape effect by the block. So the analysis of first block trials revealed a marginally significant interaction between shape condition and visual field. Irrespective of the language involved, in the left visual field, the shape effect was significant. However, in the right visual field, the effect was hardly evident. This means that only the right hemisphere generated substantial visual simulations during sentence reading. These are the results from the two experiments. So you can see that the exhibited shape effect when target pictures were presented in the left, central, and right visual fields in each language. On central presentations in experiment 1, the two languages exhibited distinct patterns of the shape effect. The effect was significantly evident only in the L1 and not in the L2. However, on lateral presentations in experiment 2, the pattern of the effect was similar in both languages. The effect was more substantial in the left visual field than in the right. So as opposed to our initial prediction and to the results of experiment 1, in experiment 2, the target language factor did not modulate the shape effect. So the results of experiment 1 suggest that visual simulations are weaker during L2 comprehension relative to L1 comprehension because a significant shape effect was exhibited only in the L1 and not in the L2. These findings support our initial prediction that when the L2 is learned and used in formal and unimmersive settings, the mental representation resulting from L2 processing is less embodied in sensory motor knowledge relative to L1 processing. These results, the results of experiment 2 suggest that visual simulations are more extensively generated in the right than in the left hemisphere, because we observed a significant shape effect only when target pictures were presented in the left visual field to the right hemisphere. In addition, the results suggest that under separate hemispheric processing, visual simulations during sentence reading are not modulated by the target language because a significant shape effect was evident in the right hemisphere irrespective of the language involved. Finally, together with the results of experiment 1, the results of experiment 2 further suggest that the right hemisphere may be less or differently involved in natural L2 reading because its significant ability to activate visual features that was observed in both languages when target pictures were presented separately to each hemisphere in experiment 2 was not evident in the L2 when target pictures were presented centrally to both hemispheres in experiment 1. So to wrap up, these two experiments revealed that the two languages of unbalanced late bilinguals who have learned and used their L2 in a formal and unimmersive fashion are processed differently, such that each language is visually embodied to a different extent, and each language may exhibit a distinct pattern of hemispheric involvement. Thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to answer any question you have. So I will.
Thank you. Any questions? I'll excuse me. I'll ask a question. So I'm still puzzled by the results, that how the results of experiment 1 go with the results of experiment 2, but I'll ask another question because I still need to think about it. Can you explain, and I think I got stuck there, and then can you explain why there are second blocks in the first experiment?
Why?
There were, in the first experiment, there was a decrease in the effect in the second block for Hebrew, and there was an increase in Hebrew in English, which I can understand because it's something that goes through translation. Maybe
you're talking about the first experiment.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the differences between the first and the second block.
Okay, so actually this is very interesting because we think it's cross-linguistic influences of the processing strategies that are employed in each language. So because in the second block, the L2 task was performed after the L1 task, and in the L1, L1 processing substantially activate visual knowledge. So this form of processing actually influence the sentence processing in the L2, and the opposite occurred in the L1. So after reading or doing the same task in the L2, the sentence reading in the L1 was less embodied, or simulations were weaker. But the L2 on L1 influence actually was stronger, because the shape effect was in the L1 was significant in the first block, but was not significant in the second block. So it was reduced and was and in the L2 in both blocks the shape effect was not significant. So it increased, but this was not significant. Yeah, so that was very interesting. The influence of both languages.
Interesting, thank you. Any other questions?
Mira?
Okay, this is an ignoramus question, really. It's hard to follow. Okay, so you seem to blame the difference between L1 and 2 in the input, in difference in inputs. But could it be not that, but rather poor second language learners, there's an overload. I mean, they have to concentrate quite a bit to understand the literal layer, that they don't have brain bites to do the rest. Is that a possibility you considered?
Yeah. Actually, we try to test relatively high participant with high proficiency in English. So we had we recruited participants with high scores in the psychometric exam in English. I don't know if it means anything, but they were supposed to be highly proficient, and regardless of this effect, this activation or visual activation is supposed to be something that happens spontaneously. So it doesn't have to, or automatically. It doesn't need to use sources in order to occur.